Let me start with you, Joe. Can you talk about the women who worked at the Triangle factory and generally about who populated the garment industry at that time? Tell us about the role also of that women played in their families as wage earners.
First of all, can you hear me? Okay. Thank you very much, Director Manzano-Diaz. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with distinguished colleagues to talk about this very important and momentous event which we're marking this week. What I'd like to say in leading up to answering your question is that I think it's very important as we mark the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, this 100th anniversary, that we take careful note of the context within which that terrible tragedy happened. And note especially that the context that marked that time is not terribly different from our own time, even though a century has passed. At the time that the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire took place, the global economy was experiencing its first great wave of change, introduced in what could be called the first wave of globalization. Immigration was changing the face, quite literally, of the American workforce. Immigrant workers, as they arrived here, especially in this second wave of immigration that produced most of the women who were victims of this fire, were uniquely exploited and subject to anti-immigrant sentiment. Not all that different, I should say, from much of what today's immigrants face. The organization of the workplace where these women worked was also changing in ways that was altering the balance of power between workers and their employers, delivering more power to employers and less to workers. This particular industry was one that was highly competitive, as many of our industries are today, and hyper-competition in that industry helped fuel the exploitation that led to this tragedy. The women, as you note, Director, were crucial wage earners in their family. 123 of the victims, as you noted, were women. Most of them were young. Most of them were under the age of 30, even very many under the age of 25. They worked primarily before marriage and children to try to accumulate enough capital to begin families. And it was in part their transitory role in this workplace that made it more easy for their employers to exploit them, unfortunately. This was a time also, like our own time, in which organized labor was really not successful yet in reaching out to and organizing these women in any sustained fashion. As you note, and as my colleague Professor Muncie will talk about in a few minutes, in 1909 there was an uprising of the 20,000 garment workers across New York City staged a strike. However, the outcome of that uprising was not leading to significant structural change, as we'll hear more about. Organized labor had not yet found a way to successfully organize people in the mass production industries like these women. And this was also a political context, I should note, that's not all that different from the one we face today. It was one in which regulation by government of workplace conditions was viewed with great suspicion. And indeed, when the U.S. Supreme Court in 1905, through its Lochner versus New York decision, had basically said that employers and workers should have quote-unquote liberty of contract, and that the state's entry into that relationship in an effort to regulate it was wrong. Just as today, there are many who question the very need for government regulation. Also in this time, as you noted in your setup, Director, there was, however, an incipient workers' rights movement that was organizing. It was led very often by people outside of organized labor's traditional ranks, the National Women's Trade Union League, allies of the union movement, and the National Consumers League, which helped to organize this event, played a key role in that. These factors that set the context for what happened in 1911 are not all that different, I would suggest, from what we face today. And now just very briefly, regarding your question of the immigrants and the women. These were, and we should not forget, very largely immigrant workers. If you go down the list of the names of those workers, let me just read you the first names that you'll find. Adler, Altman, Ardito, Bassito, Benanti, Berger, Bernstein, Balada, Binowitz, Brenman, Brodsky. Down at the end of the list, Wiener, Weintraub, Weisner, Welfowitz, Wendorf, Wysotsky. These were names that you would not have found in the United States very commonly 20 years earlier. They were people who came here seeking promise, most of them coming either as young immigrants themselves or being just born here of immigrant parents, and entering an industry in which they found a great deal of exploitation, as I've said. They were, as you've noted, overwhelmingly women. Golda, Gussie, Esther, Fanny, Maria, Giuseppa, Jenny, Rose, Lucia, Sadie, Michelina, Yetta, Annie, Sadie. Their role in their families was absolutely essential because the wages that they were bringing home through this work was helping their families be able to make it at all in America. And they were deployed as part of a family unit to try to compensate for the low wages that others in the family were getting. Rose Cohen, a survivor of the fire, recalled how she got her job. Her father got it for her. Father told me one night that he had found work for me in a shop where he knew the presser, Rose said. I lay awake all that night. I was eager to begin life on my own responsibility, but I was also afraid. She had good reason to be afraid, not just entering the strange world of wage work as a very young woman, and you should know that the youngest victim of the fire was only 15. But she also had reason to be afraid because of the conditions that she found there. The hyper-competition, the low capital barriers to entry into this work, the piece rates that the women were paid, which made them work harder to make more money, and the low regard for worker safety that was part of what they encountered there are things we should remember. And again, sadly, I think too often today they're replicated in many of our workplaces all around us. I should note that just last week, a construction worker on my campus, Georgetown University, died in an accident. That today workers still face dangerous conditions. Everybody in this room knows the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. You've all heard of it, and that's part of what brings you out here today. But I doubt that many people here know just how untypical, or rather how typical, rather, that this event was. Exactly 4 months to the day before this fire occurred an industrial accident that I'm sure nobody here probably knows about at all. It took place in Newark, New Jersey on November 25th, 1910, in a 4-story factory, again, a garment factory. 25 workers, mostly young women, died in that fire. 6 were burned to death. 19 of them died jumping to their death, just as happened at Triangle. In the aftermath of that fire, the New York City fire chief warned, quote, "This city may have a fire as deadly as the one in Newark at any time. There are buildings in New York where the danger is every bit as great as in the building destroyed in Newark. A fire in the daytime," he warned, "would be accompanied by, quote, a terrible loss of life." He warned about this tragedy we mark here 4 months before it happened. But of course, that warning fell on deaf ears. And that says something about the time in which this event occurred and about how expendable the lives of the women that we're here to mark today were viewed in that time. And I think that this is a crucial thing for us to remember today and for us to reflect on whether or not we are receiving similar warnings today about the dangers all around us, warnings that we should mark. So, thank you.
Thank you.